Welcome to Build Better, where we're having conversations explicitly trying to help engineers, manufacturers build better electronics products. My name is Anna Shidletsky. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Instrumental, where we build AI-empowered technologies to build better electronics. I'm joined here today by Patrick McGee, who's formerly part of the Financial Times and has been covering, still on book leave from the Financial Times, and has been covering Apple for a large part of his career, and has recently published a new book called Apple in China. And I think one of the main theses of the book is that Apple and China are pretty inextricably linked, that Apple's investment into China was massive and essentially maybe had a hand in making China what it is today, but also at the same time kind of allowed Apple to lose a lot of control over what itself does. And so they are tied together in a way where they've made each other, and divorcing those two could be very challenging. So that was at least one of my takeaways. I'm sure there's others, and we'll talk about them here. One of the exciting parts about my job is that I get to see inside of a lot of different electronics companies. I am ex-Apple, so I have some Apple context as well. But one of the things that I was thinking while I was reading this book about how Apple kind of sleepwalks into essentially teaching an entire nation how to compete with it, and to very effectively compete with it, is how we may be doing that still with other parts of the process, not just teaching suppliers to manufacture products or to manufacture products and bringing them up to speed, but also like the continued abdication of ownership of the innovation or the engineering of the actual devices that are supposed to be what we're building and engineering as part of electronics companies here in the United States. And so I think that's like actually a concerning trend that I've seen, and maybe we can use this conversation as a jumping off point to talk about what we can learn from the historical analysis that you've done of what Apple's done, and maybe project forward to like where there could be concerns as it relates to further abdication of design and innovation, of like even just the ownership going more towards I just buy a box and put a label on it kind of model, and how that I think is quite threatening to at least the US electronics and tech industry.
Perfect.
All right. So you argue that Apple kind of sleepwalked, I think is words I've heard you use, which I like, into making China indispensable, and that this has become a strategic liability, not just for Apple, but for the entire electronics industry.
Yeah.
Are other companies today repeating that same sleepwalk, or have they also been sleepwalking, or maybe more? What's your take?
So I've so burrowed into my own little rabbit hole that I don't have expertise outside of that.
Yeah.
So Tesla is a section in the book as well. And I think they've basically, it's not that they've made the same mistake and now I'm realizing it. They intentionally do what Apple does, right? I mean, they're basically told by the mayor of Shanghai, like, we want you to do for the EV industry what Apple has done for the phone industry or the computer industry. And to set that plan into motion, they literally hire a bunch of people in China that have Apple experience to do that, and I think very successfully. And this is the origin of why Tesla is able to become the first wholly owned foreign automaker in China. No JV, and they're operating within 12 months of setting up, of cutting the ribbon on the factory, as it were, instead of the 24 months that Elon Musk had proposed. So they're able to get these subsidies and such, and it's really the quid pro quo of that. Tesla is going to train up the supply chain. And I think, within 24 months of the Model Y, the Model 3 being made out of Shanghai, suddenly Chinese EVs, like across the board, are really good. I mean, even before Trump 2.0 comes into power, Biden puts 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. I mean, I was a German auto reporter until 2019. The Chinese EV story was not a story. Right? And that's how quickly it shifts. So I think...
and there have been US automakers who've been trying to catch up to Tesla. And as someone who has purchased an EV in the last 5 years, there was a decade, you could tell, sitting in these different cars, that there was a decade of difference between what you can buy from even Korean automakers, US automakers versus Tesla, in terms of what the product offering is to the consumer. But I've been very impressed to see we have Chinese wholly foreign-owned entity as well, and we have Chinese team, and they have bought Chinese EVs, and I've ridden in them, and they're amazing. There is not that delta. These are on par vehicles that have been developed.
Yeah, so the marriage of Apple and China is really one of skill and scale, and I think you could say the same of Tesla. Whether there's a whole range of other companies, I don't know. But there's only so many companies that are even at that level, right?
Well, a lot
Because
of
most
them did
companies
like
aren't doing.
joint development
Yeah.
they essentially gave some IP, right? And that wasn't sleepwalking. That was like part of the bargain.
Yeah.
But it kind of feels like, well, it certainly seems like the Apple model was more successful for both China and for Apple.
Yeah.
Versus like those JV style models, such that what your argument of like that the Shanghai leader actually like wanted to replicate that as it related to Tesla.
And one thing I just want to clarify is when I say sleepwalking, I think sometimes it sounds like a biting remark, and it's actually sort of intended to be the opposite. Because my point is that the executives in the early 2000s who made the decision, I don't really hold their feet to the fire.
Well, they were chasing shareholder value, right?
Yeah, like they were,
which is what they should be doing.
And they were doing so at a time when Washington would have frankly encouraged it.
Yes.
I mean, maybe not flat out encouraged, but the whole American consensus, the paradigm, if you will, was we're going to inculcate the next great democracy. So I'm saying sleepwalked because we didn't really understand the political dynamic at play. And maybe China did. That's not entirely clear to me either. Like the newest books on China basically say China was never going to be a democracy or whatever. I actually don't really agree with that. I think it was possible, but we sort of took our eyes off the ball by, after September 11th, America really focused on the Middle East. After Lehman Brothers, we focused on the financial crisis. So I think there was, I don't think history is so, linear or what am I trying to say, like materially going in one direction. I hold out hope for not hope, but the prospect of alternative paths that could have been taken. And yes. I think, China is sort of building a middle class that overthrew.
You don't believe in providence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was nothing inevitable about Xi Jinping, right? The previous decade really shapes the dynamics for a hardliner to come into power. And so I disagree with that. So anyway, so just the point on sleepwalking.
Yeah.
I
interpret it to mean like nobody made the strategic decision that we're gonna like train up an entire nation of people, and that we should even talk about that.
Yeah.
And like at the time, the business was just trying to survive, and it was trying to find suppliers who could. It was trying to compete, and like it actually like never had like a significant portion of market share in those early days.
And
which is an argument you make in the book.
People either forget or they're just too young and don't know just how precarious Apple's position was. So the reason the book after the prologue begins in 1996 is because even before Steve Jobs has come back, I mean, they're days from missing payroll and the company is going to be over.
Yeah.
And so, they almost die in 96, they almost die in 97, they almost die in 2000. And so you have to understand that when they're going off to China, it's not the powerful Apple that we know now. It is just this scrappy company that's doing, in retrospect, hilarious things like when they're working in Taiwan and Southeast Asia, like they're hand carrying prototypes from one place to another. Like this is not strictly there's not strictly speaking legal, but they were a scrappy company. Yeah.
Commercial samples.
Yeah. Okay.
I think. I'm not a lawyer. I think it's like a really fascinating thing. And as an entrepreneur myself, are you really a real company if you haven't had a near-death experience? At least one, maybe more. Yeah. Okay, so from your reporting, what second or third order consequences of outsourcing kind of surprised you the most? So, Apple outsources to this set of supply chain within China, many different vendors. And maybe there are ones that are like less obvious from the start. Just kind of interested, like what were things that you found that surprised you, that you think might be interesting for our audience?
So I wonder if I can reframe the question a little bit just to say like, what are the second order consequences of having an aesthetic, like design first mentality at Apple? Because then then it's less direct. In other words, by having Johnny Ive, Steve Jobs tells Johnny Ive about the iMac, make it lickable. Right? Like he really wants this computer to look nothing like any computer has had before. And so I think we in the media and probably investors and others have only sort of looked at the first order consequences, which is that, you design this brilliant computer. And so consumers are able to get something that doesn't look like anything else. And the second order impact is that we've forgotten that in order to build it in the hundreds of thousands, you had to effectively transplant that like Hollywood version of Steve Jobs that we all know, who like yells at everyone but brings up everybody around him. And you actually transplant that whole sort of paradigm into, in this case, Korea, but later China, right? So it's like having this design first, zero tolerance for defects that is in Cupertino ends up having this huge effect on like 4 major industrial clusters in China. Yep. Like that's nuts. But I'm almost creating like the distance between like if you ask the second order impact of the outsourcing, well, I don't know, because then I'm making something that's too direct, which is that it has this big impact in Asia. So I'm not even sure what the other possibilities would be. There's probably several.
Well, I think it's interesting that you view Apple. I mean, it's true. Like, I'm not saying it's not true. It's interesting your perspective as like a design focused company, because as someone from the inside of Apple, like I was there from 2009 2015. I was a low level engineer, not a lot of power, so like was not in the smoky rooms
And
where
in
things were
ops.
happening. In product design.
In product design, in PD.
And
Okay.
and so like I certainly we were very hard on suppliers and brought everybody up around us. And it's not that like when I'm like 21 years old, I don't know how to run a factory. I don't know how to make an iPod either. I just like was bestowed with the authority to go make it happen.
Yes.
And to work with a team of smart and dedicated people to make it happen and invent what we needed to make happen. And it was one of the best parts of being at Apple was I felt like, for me, the massive impact was like you'd sit on the line and your stuff is not working and you could literally like take a Sharpie and like, make a change. And 5 minutes later, that's what's coming off the end of the line and those units can go into tests. And it's just like this fantastic idea that you could like literally make a change and have this influence. You got 20,000 people who are like at the beck and call to like make it happen.
Yes.
And we'd have impossible things we were trying to do and we were actually not allowed to use the word impossible.
Right.
You could only use the word challenging.
Yes. Well, engineers have lots of funny things, right? So in the book, people joke about Steve Jobs asking for that the next laptop would be made out of unobtainium. Right? There's lots of funny jokes about Apple. You probably know a lot more of them than I do that come out of this. But I guess what I find interesting about that, I don't quote Steve Jobs saying this, but he was known for giving a shit. Right. Mm-hmm. And there was this in a recent interview, someone used a Mandarin phrase in China, obviously, where like it basically means good enough, and that would never be a phrase within Apple. Right. You always had to push to the limit. So even if you're not sort of training the Chinese something that already, came out of grad school, you are sort of transplanting a little bit of Steve Jobsian DNA.
Yes.
Just by having that high expectation.
Yes. And then as a result, I would say it's like an execution-focused organization, or at least it was in the time that I was there. I think what Apple has that it's world-class is its ability to execute at scale. And that's in partnership with all of its vendors that it's like invested over decades in building.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the 90s and 2000s, Apple strategy was to deeply co-develop with partners and suppliers, building know-how into their products and process. I kind of alluded to this in the intro, like I'm seeing something that I view as kind of dangerous. I think it's dangerous because I'm a product design engineer by training and I like to imagine that my role is important. And, as a product design engineer, you work the CAD, but you also are responsible for knowing how the parts are going to interact, knowing the process on the line. You go and you spend time on the line, wherever that line is, to actually understand how you're going to build this thing and get to mass production yields at mass production speeds. And that level of like high ownership and understanding of your product and high ownership of like, even if you own a part in the product, that like my part needs to meet my specs, be awesome, be robust, etc. I feel like I've seen a shift in some companies today towards more and more outsourcing of the ownership mentality. And so like I talk internally here about like, we can often tell how a conversation with different potential company will go by looking at where their executives come from. Are they going to follow the Apple way, the Amazonian way, the Google way, the Microsoft way? There's a different flavor. Depending on like what cultural ethos someone brings to an organization. And I'm just worried that there seems to be this change that's happening in the industry towards even outsourcing the understanding and the innovation of the parts themselves. So if you're building, some cutting edge new system that has new optics, or, like wearables is probably now going to be a whole thing with AI, like agentic AI. What are the devices that enable AI to go with you everywhere? And so like we may be doing, I read this whole book as like we did this before with like all the knowledge on how to build the products, but I worry that we may also be outsourcing now even the know-how of like, this part goes next to this part because of this, or like when there's this problem, here's the 5 different ways that we could fix it. Like the expertise of even understanding our own products, like as American electronics industry, as American technology industry, we no longer have a lot of interest in having that expertise here.
Yeah.
And so like, I think, you deeply studied what happened when some of this expertise was essentially transferred in a massive transfer into another location. Like, can you extrapolate or pontificate on what you think could happen with the abdication of even like the design knowledge itself? Like, is there even then an electronics industry in the United States? Like, are we just then brands that we just slap our names on things?
Right.
Like,
which is interesting because that's where PC industry was in the 90s when the Taiwanese would just say, here's a catalog of designs.
Yeah, exactly.
Pick one, and then we'll badge it IBM. And Apple was so anti, they were totally antithesis of that. And yet the irony that that's what you're worried about as an ex-Apple person 25 years later is kind of fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying that Apple is doing this. I'm just saying in general across the market, I have seen teams where I am surprised to find a lack of ownership and kind of an abdication. There's been like an interesting time in high volume consumer electronics in the pandemic period, or the during and post-pandemic period, where like during the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of travel back and forth. So there was a lot of abdication of like ownership to local in-region teams. And what I've seen is that has continued and persisted. Versus like ownership and expertise being valued in the headquarters of wherever that company is, like the innovation of the core technology of that device.
So I'll give a few answers. So one, I don't know this for a fact, but someone that worked on the Portal, the Facebook device, good example because it's dead now, so I can't offend anyone. I mean, I was told nobody in Facebook knows how to make the Portal. In other words, they designed it and then they just had teams in Asia that could just take care of it. So if you're sort of pointing to, is that the future?
So that would be like a JDM model. We would call that a JDM model, maybe, or I mean, maybe it goes as far to say ODM. Did they just put their label on it? Like, I imagine they had a design, they had a CAD.
Right. Yeah. I hope so.
I think one of the important pieces is like who owns the CAD. And so like if your company, if you're the technology company and you own the CAD, like you have some amount of ownership of like that thing.
Right.
But like if you've abdicated even the CAD, you are now just like mostly an ODM putting your label on something.
That's a great specific question because I might be able to go find the answer, and I don't know that the answer is obvious. Okay, the Apple answer is I was told that pre-pandemic, for a new iPhone launch, it would be common for 500 people to go off to Asia to be there, days in advance, weeks in advance, months in advance, working with all the suppliers hand in hand to make sure that they're up to the scale challenges.
Actually, that seems low if you're also including suppliers and weeks and months in advance. But yes, it's large. It's large.
Okay, and then all of that really came to a standstill during COVID. So the number fell to, I'm told, 30 to 50 people. And then my lazy assumption is, well, once COVID ended, of course, you went back to the old model. And I was told, no, absolutely not, because basically the Chinese teams, right? There's now 5 R&D hubs in China for Apple. They were able to prove that they could step up. And so, the company is led by Tim Cook, right? He's like a cost cutter. He's an Excel sheet guy. And so if you've proven that you can do it, then you don't go back to the old model. And so, as critical as I am in the book of the old model, which is that the Americans, as it were, have the experiential know-how, but they're flying in and out and, embedding that transfer of knowledge into the Chinese factories.
Or the cultural know-how, maybe, is the other way of putting it. Because, again, it's 21 years old. I did not know better than my factory counterparts how to build an iPod.
That's fair. I think I would embed the cultural know-how in the engineering know-how.
We need something awesome.
Right.
And that was like my role, I think, to play.
Okay. So I totally understand. But as problematic, let's say, as I view that model to be in terms of the geopolitical repercussions that I don't think anyone really saw coming, at least it's in the know-how of the people that are basically based in Cupertino, where they can then pontificate about what the next device is going to be, meet Johnny Ive or whatever, and do it. If you are basically losing that, then that really does worry me about Apple's long-term future for 5, 10, 15 years from now. And, there was a recent job ad for another PD position in China, and someone emailed it to me and they said, I wonder how long until ID jobs are being made in China, right? And then you'd be really saying like the logo
essentially
needs to be upended.
Company, then.
Well, yeah, and people have made that argument, and I sort of don't go that far, but I certainly understand where people are going from that. I mean, Apple has 160,000 employees roughly globally, right? And actually most of those are in retail. But, indirectly in China alone, it supports 3 million jobs. So like, I think it's an open question as to like, well, how American is this company? But I really worry about that experience.
As we think about like other think about other companies, which I know you didn't research, but like, the rest of FANG, or like other companies that are building technology products who are ostensibly American technology companies or based here. They're multinationals, but they're like based here. Like if you build in-region teams, which many of them did during the pandemic, and those in-region teams don't have to be in China. Some are in China, some in Vietnam, other places in Greater Asia as well. There was like this kind of everybody experimenting with that. And it's been interesting to see some of those companies have like kept that model and continue to invest in region because it can be cheaper. And others kind of pull back from that model. We saw an interesting kind of thing where a lot of people tried to go JDM, which is joint development manufacturing. So that's where a lot of you share the engineering between the brand and the factory partner.
Right.
And so that means there's engineers who are changing things on the CAD who are there at the vendor, at the factory partner. And that's kind of like on the spectrum of how much ownership you have. That's a low ownership kind of model. Just one step above like putting your label on something someone else made.
Yep.
And then there's like, the contract manufacturing models, like where you just hired the vendor, you have the design, you own the design, you're hiring the vendor to make it, you're collaborating, there's collaboration, there is like, you're paying them for certain types of expertise maybe that they're selling you as part of this, but it's not joint development. It is more like I am a customer, I'm the brand and I'm a customer and you are building this thing for me. We saw a big swing where during the pandemic, a lot of companies went kind of JDM thinking that this would be a way to cut costs. And then they didn't get the quality they wanted because they lost control. And for some businesses, that was fine because maybe the quality of their product wasn't a core part of the value proposition. But then we saw a big swing back into CM. Like we saw multiple companies in that like mid-market pull back into CM model, which means they have more ownership and more, they are staffing appropriately to have that ownership.
Right.
So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. And in that JDM model, I think a lot of companies forgot that like the D stands for development. It doesn't stand for production, and you still need to support production and quality in production. So I think there's been like an interesting thing where there's like abdication to varying degrees. But what I've seen very recently has been like, we don't even have engineers who can understand like what kinds of defects, how you even do failure analysis on this type of defect. And that just like shook me to my core, because that really means you really then don't understand the product that you're supposedly owning and building. And then why even have the engineering team like in the United States if essentially the only people who know how to actually fix anything with the product or anything in the design are elsewhere.
Which I think gets to one other problem that Apple's facing, which is that there's like attrition, right? Like the people have aged, and you've had a lot of VPs leave in the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm sure a bunch of senior directors and others. But a lot of those people, if you like someone like Deirdre O'Brien, right, who's been in Tim Cook's inner circle for years. I mean, she joined the company in 1988. I mean, those types of people have so much like negotiating power, supply chain expertise, manufacturing expertise. And some of it comes from, like, you think of that, her first 15 years would have been a time when Apple was really building its own products, right? So she's like a fingers in the pie type person that can really figure things out.
Yeah.
I mean, the people coming out of college now don't have anything like that. Yeah. And I've heard people, older engineers from Apple talking to newbies, and they can't believe that during their design coursework, whatever, like they'd never actually done anything with a CNC machine or something.
I mean, I didn't learn how to do a tolerance stack until I arrived at Apple.
Yeah, so if you're not doing that, because America doesn't have the industry, then the whole model of like we're teaching suppliers how to do it all and come up with the next innovations, like that's going to sort of fall apart.
We're definitely not teaching Americans anymore. Like,
no, well, I mean, Like
I feel like fresh grads who, like Apple retains its people for a long period of time. There are people like me and others who like leave and go off and do other things.
Yeah.
And, their expertise is very valued because it's a very great engineering and operational training. Even, it was back in the aughts in the pre-pandemic period.
Yeah.
And I wonder if they're still making that kind of engineer anymore. And maybe in certain departments they are. Like in certain functions, there's still that kind of vintage Apple way.
Yeah.
But I have certainly talked to folks where I wonder, are we creating the next generation of people who really understand the finger in the pie? Because everybody in leadership at Apple, that's one of the things that's really you can admire about Apple leadership is that they had all done the job of the people below them.
Right. Like
at some point in their career, they had like done this. I reported to someone who had like literally sat on the line and like had designed a part and probably, went wrong. So they themselves had intuition for like, have you tried A, B, C, D, and F? And so you could view that as micromanagement, that a VP is telling you, like, have you tried these 5 things? But like, I think that also made it very effective because you have leadership that intimately understands and quickly, like, they're in the details.
Yeah.
And so you don't have this like layers of obfuscation that you might have in other organizations. And I've certainly seen, like, I worked inside of Apple as an individual contributor, so I got to see some of that. And then subsequently, for the last decade, we've worked with companies that are all sorts of companies and gotten to see inside those different like structural pieces of like, where do leaders come from and do they actually know the details of the people underneath them? And sometimes in different organizations they value different things than that particular knowledge. So I think there's also like an interesting evolution there in the market.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Where do you think, for yourself, where do you draw the line between smart operational decisions, like cut costs, and like a dangerous dependence on a particular partner? And when do you think Apple actually crossed that particular line? Because I think like reading the book kind of just gets like worse and worse and get in deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
Where do you think that line got crossed, where it became like dangerously dependent?
So I think there's a narrow way to take that question, and the narrow one's above my pay grade, right? Which is like some engineering question. The Apple narrative answer, I think, is the prologue to the book, which is when CCTV attacks Apple within 36 hours of Xi Jinping becoming president. And if I'm being fair to Apple, I would say, they didn't understand that Xi Jinping was going to be someone that was going to take a third term, a decade later, right? Like they've been in the era of Hu Jintao, where like China's like a multinational playground, and Apple's got people bending over backwards to take their orders. And it takes years for scholars to understand that like Xi Jinping's drive towards, fighting corruption, for instance, is actually air cover to install a bunch of people close to him so that he can become like a Putin of China. If I'm being unsympathetic to Apple, I would say the very attack from CCTV, which I think would absolutely have to have Xi Jinping's approval, they are like the first victim, as it were. Like if someone's going to have a wake-up call immediately, it frankly should have been Apple. I mean, if you remember, it's 3 weeks, I call it digital blitzkrieg, where state-backed media, regulators, social media are just attacking this company, and it leads to Apple having to really forcefully apologize to Xi and to China and to Chinese consumers. And it's a time when during these 3 weeks, like sales stall, essentially across China. And so Apple has this real wake-up call. Now, as the narrative goes on to explain, this is part 5 of the book, right? So there's quite a bit before then. It's that Apple basically finds a way to like double down, triple down in China to basically like build enough like Guangxi political connections with Chinese officials at every level to make sure that any potential obstacle is removed, that the Chinese really understand, look, we're making massive contributions to Made in China 2025. I argue that Apple inadvertently becomes the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025 and indigenous innovation in the country. But I do think that's the same moment in which they could have sort of, felt the alarm of that situation and thought, we need to diversify now. Like this is an untenable position for the long term. And Apple should have had a clear sense of what its impact was, because they'd already had that impact in Korea, in Taiwan, in other markets. And so, it's fairly early years at that point for the iPhone, right? It's 5-6 years old at that point. And I would have loved to see them, instead of announce a big shareholder buyback program, which I believe happens in that, if it's not that same year, it's within months of that year ending. I would have loved to see money go into some sort of special, unit that was going into building resilient supply chain in India or some such thing. But back to being sympathetic to Apple again, and I do think it's my job as a journalist to sort of see both ends here, right? You have to understand that, the iPhone goes from 5 million units in 2007 to almost 250 million by 2015. So 2013, I mean, this is a time when they're just moving from like 120 million or so units and doubling that. And so, as you'll appreciate better than me, because you lived it, I mean, the operational demands on satiating that global demand was just enormous.
Yep.
And so the idea that someone would come in, let alone like a journalist, and say like, you probably diversify like worldwide, like I can understand that would have been seen as just like, I'm trying not to swear here, right? But like go F yourself. Like that's not going to happen. And so, the narrative, this is why I say they sleepwalked into this, because I don't really hold someone to account for not making that decision. But if there's a time when it could have been made, when someone could have made some heroic policy change or something, I think that's what it would be. And then there's the last thing I would point out is like Steve Jobs has only been dead for around 18 months at this point. And so it's sort of a natural question to ask, like, what happens to Apple if Steve Jobs was still around when Xi Jinping came into power and sort of made this implicit demands like thou shalt make more in China and if not you're going to be in trouble kind of thing. Like it's such a good thought experiment, and I don't think it's a flippant like of course he wouldn't do this. Like I would like to think that it would have been a real test of his integrity, but it's a worthy thought experiment for anyone who's thinking about this.
I always think about what Steve Jobs would have thought about screen time and children.
Yeah. I have to say it's interesting as an Apple reporter how little Apple is part of that conversation. In other words, Instagram, TikTok, I mean, they get sort of taken to the cleaners, but the actual creator of the device, not so much. And it's not like they've played some huge role, mitigating the damage. Like they've got like the screen time app or whatever, and that's kind of it. Like I don't know what else Apple has done.
You can turn off certain applications after a certain amount of time, but I think. There's a certain generation of people, of which I am one of, that remembers the world before smartphones and the world before the internet. I mean, or before high-speed internet, dial-up. Yeah. And so, there's like for us, like everything was like unique and new and like awesome, like, or at least for me, the internet and like these devices are unique and new and awesome. And I think for the subsequent generation, there's like none of that joy associated with it. And a lot of. I mean, it would be interesting to what Steve Jobs.
Well, we're both parents of young kids, right? Yes, so we're seeing this in the next generation ourselves.
Thinking about it. So, if Apple has essentially built the world's largest vocational school, training 3 million workers a year.
Yeah, the number that Apple gives out itself, right, is since 2008 they've trained 28 million people.
Okay.
So the number 3 million a year, that's a Tim Cook number. I don't know exactly what he's counting because I've got some internal Apple documents that talk about labor demand in China. And so in March, it's around 800,000 or 900,000, and then it ramps up to 1.8 million
in September.
September.
Yeah.
So you like in other words,
there's also like massive turnover.
Yes.
In the supply chain.
So
3 million a year kind of makes
my
sense.
guess is that there's never 3 million people at once.
Oh no, it's not like a school that has 3 million people enrolled in it.
Exactly. and so I think Tim Cook's figure is he's using. Within a 12-month period, there are 3 million people that have worked for the company.
Yeah. And so what advantage, because it has done this and it's trained massive amounts of people, what advantage does it actually retain in doing that? I mean, I think it had advantages at the time and being able to, the means justify the ends in terms of like growth for the company and meeting the demand for its devices, of which there was lots of demand. But has the student become the master in this case?
Yeah. I mean, I that's a sentence in the book. Well, to give the historical answer, right? Like, in order to create the translucent Bondi Blue iMac, like nobody knew how to build that, right? And so, like, I have a whole chapter called Unmanufacturable, where the engineers in PD are trying to respond to Johnny Ive's demands, and, like, they're not doing it, and like loads of them are just quitting because it's just too difficult. And in a sense, by imposing on the team something that was unmanufacturable, and it's not that they eventually do it. Johnny Ive has to change the design, but like I don't know how orchestrated this was. It probably wasn't, given the dire straits of the company. But by having demands that were literally impossible, it sort of weeded out. So like only the best people that were really, really willing to try day after day for months were the ones that were left. And so by the time there was a design tweak, they could actually do it, right? Because there's a guy who I quote in the book who's basically saying, like, we were treated as absolute heroes because we actually did it. But like the reality was, like, we were asked to do something that wasn't impossible. The other team was. And so like I don't view myself as like a better engineer than that other person. But the whole experience for the team was what I was told, that like that's when they really bonded,
So as we think about like, okay, so that team of people had developed this particular expertise.
Yes, but then they go to Asia, right? Korea in particular, for at least for the final assembly and the building the CRT monitor and everything and doing all the, the plastic injection molding and all that. And so, the benefit, to answer your question, it was like, well, that just had to be done. Otherwise, Johnny Ive's design was never going to leave, MoMA, right? The Museum of Modern Art. Like, to actually have it on people's desks, you had to do it. And then it's like that mentality multiplied by the company being so much more successful with the iPhone at scale by 2015, that again, you had to train everybody up to Apple standards. Otherwise, you weren't going to have the iPhone in that immaculate quality and the year after year design changes and that sort of thing. So it's
and do
like,
you think it retains that advantage, or do you think that advantage has been lost now?
Well, no,
because
that's,
they've
I mean,
essentially
yeah,
trained,
that's kind of the
and
narrative. The
now
student
like
absolutely has become the master.
Huawei,
Yeah.
Oppo, like these.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I had one phone to go like wow your staff with, it's not made by Apple. It's going to be Huawei's Mate XT because it unfolds twice. In Apple terms, it's an iPhone and an iPad in one. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that Apple like could build that but decided not to. Like, I think the better design ideas are now coming out of China, but they're better after working with Apple for 10 years, right? And I don't know that that was understood by Cupertino. And in fact, my favorite chapter is probably 5-Alarm Fire, which is chapter 36. And it's my favorite because suddenly I'm no longer quoting all the people I spoke to for the book. I'm suddenly quoting internal documents because I found more than 1,000 pages that were produced in court discovery, but hitherto unreported on. And I mean, it is just Apple people in panic. I mean, including Tim Cook, who writes, "This is a disaster. We need all hands on deck now," because the Chinese are all buying Huawei phones instead of the new 10R phone. And it's because they really mimicked the Infinity Pool-like design, right? This was a big deal. This wasn't just any design. This is the 10th anniversary iPhone. And suddenly the 4 major brands in China are all doing it. And Apple is stunned by it, right? Yeah. And so it's called 5-Alarm Fire because the vice president, compares it to this fire scene where you need at least 100 people to go put it out. So it's this massive deal. And, the net result of it is that Apple issues its first revenue warning in 16 years, right? So the first of Tim Cook's tenure. So I think the gravity of that situation is enormous. And the other thing I could point out that it leads to is basically a brazen obfuscation, if not lie, to Apple shareholders about the nature of demand in China for Apple products.
So what do you think today's technical leaders get wrong about globalization and operational strategy?
I love these big questions. These are questions I wouldn't pass an interview on. So let's see how good I am at this.
I mean, that's who our audience is leaders. Yeah. Leaders. You spoke to a lot of people for this book. Yeah. Over 200 people, and some of them, most of them, I don't know, probably not at Apple anymore, probably leaders elsewhere. So you've actually spoken to a lot of people with a lot of expertise. Yeah. And what do you think that either they say they think their peers are getting wrong, or that Apple got wrong, or that anybody is thinking incorrectly about globalization and operations?
Okay, so let me answer 2 ways. One, and I'm just going to give you the reminder. So one is Chinafication, the other is hubris. So I might need hubris as the keyword. Okay, so one, I'm sort of stealing from my own introduction here. I don't think the last 30 years of the electronic supply chain is a story of globalization. It's a story of Chinafication. Yeah. So the very first iPhone has very little Chinese technology inside, but the real estate of Chinese companies has sort of taken over. There's a little empire of China within the real estate of the iPhone. Yeah. And so it's becoming more and more Chinese.
And the bomb, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. What am I trying to say? In place, not of American companies in America, but in place of US multinationals operating in China, Korean multinationals operating in China. And so I have this, chapter called The Red Supply Chain that's talking about how Taiwanese companies like Foxconn, Wistron, Quanta, Pegatron, they're all being squeezed out by the Chinese competitors. But you could tell that story through any number of components. I only limit it to final assembly for the sake of word count and, research time. But, there's a whole bunch of companies like Beal Crystal in China that have, I think, more than 70,000 people in Apple's labor demand that are working in that factory. And at the time that I was looking at that was more than all labor demand in Vietnam, right? So there were 14 factories involved with Apple production in Vietnam at the time. I think this is 2018 or so. And Beal Crystal, a company that most people haven't heard of, had more labor demand just in one factory in China.
For one component.
So among the things that people get wrong is that they look at Apple's 200, top suppliers document that comes out every year. And you get this overwhelming sense that, okay, yeah, some things are moving to China, but look at them diversifying to Vietnam and India. And it's yeah, but you're treating the factories as one for one. Yeah. When the ones in China are way larger, right? Where Zhengzhou has 400,000 people at peak iPhone season. There's nothing like that in India. And so when people do reporting, and this was a Financial Times report that said, Foxconn was investing in a new factory in India, and I think it's $1.5 billion, and 30,000 people are going to be living there in dorms. Well, that sounds like a lot until you remember that there's 3 million people in China. So that's 1%, right? And 1.5 billion isn't really a lot. So like the diversification to India is happening way slower than people think. And I think if you ask the layperson, let's say the lay tech person, they have to have some sort of competence in the area, what the story was about Apple's relationship with China over the last 5 to 10 years, they would say, oh, they're really diversifying, they're de-risking, and they would cite stories about Vietnam and India or whatever. And I think while that's true, it pales in importance to the fact that Apple's gotten closer, built more political connections, and is relying more and more on Chinese companies, right? And the reason they have to do that, among other reasons, is that the peak year for making iPhones was a decade ago, right? We have not seen any growth in unit sales in a decade at Apple. And so what do? You raise prices and you get better margins. And the way you get better margins is you work with local Chinese supply chain companies who have political connections where they can get the migrant labor, they can get the free tooling, they can get the machinery. They have a directive that's not just about, and really not even at all about shareholder dividends or something. It's about the political connections to sort of be the leader. And, my worry about China isn't that it's like a scary country. And I don't think the book is very anti-China. It's that China is just so big that if they prioritize anything as a strategic priority, other nations get deindustrialized as a result. Like that is just how big they are in something like the battery supply chain, in something like solar panels. Like good luck, coming up with a solar panel startup in New York or something. Like you're not going to be able to compete. And EVs, I think, are on that path. And smartphones have already gone down that path. So that would be the one answer. The second one I'll make much shorter is hubris. I've talked to people that are currently at Apple, and they basically look at the last 25 years and think of it as an Apple story. So therefore, we can do what we did in China and India. Look at the wages in India. It's pretty similar to where China was 25 years ago. So we're going to go replicate that playbook. And the irony of that is sometimes I'm criticized from sound bites rather than the book for not giving enough credit to China. Yeah. And I'm like, are you kidding? I'm giving so much credit to China, so much so that I don't think they could do this anywhere else. So it's like, my point is that Apple's not giving the credit to China because they don't understand, even if you've got great engineers and you're building, some massive facility and training the workforce, the biggest vocational school in China, et cetera, who's building the 8-lane highway from the factories to the port?
Or the power plants.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so much things. And so there's so much that's outside of their control, but that China, with this like Nietzschean will to power, was willing to build, not just Beijing, but the provincial officials. And the book goes through some nuance to understand Chinese capitalism as it's distinguished from Soviet communism. And so I don't see that in India. I don't see that in Tamil Nadu or Karnataka. Like you don't have the same culture. You don't have the same authoritarian top-down government that works with local cadres who are incentivized and stuff. Done. Yeah, you don't. And like the thing is, I would love to see it, right? Like sometimes when you're like ideological about something, you're blind to the other evidence. Like I'm ideological to I want to see iPhones built in Pittsburgh, but it's not going to happen. I'm ideological towards promoting democracy and wanting to see more iPhone development and stuff in India, but it's not going to happen. I have all the reasons to find the evidence that's counter to the points that I'm making, and I just don't see any of the points that would really be strong contenders for why India is going to be the next great manufacturing power.
So what technical leaders are getting wrong is that they're viewing this as they're viewing kind of the geopolitical elements as it relates to globalization as being global. Yeah. But actually it's really about China. And that's a mistake. They need to be thinking about it as it was about China. And now what do we do now to actually have globalization? And that maybe what was bad about it was putting all of our eggs in one basket. Any basket just happened to be the China basket versus distributing our eggs to many baskets.
Yeah, well,
as it relates to the knowledge.
The phrase, what gets managed gets measured?
Yes.
If I was to sort of have
what gets measured gets managed, right?
Okay, so am I saying wrong? What gets managed? Yeah. And so it strikes me that the things that my book is about, like the downsides of what the Cook strategy is, are intangible. Right? Where on the Excel sheet do you cite Beijing's political clout, right? Or their geopolitical power? How do you cite the propensity for Beijing to annex Taiwan? I mean, that doesn't show up. And so if you're looking at margins and stuff, it actually leads you in the direction of why don't we work with more local companies?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big miss. And one thing I think Americans miss in the news discourse, let's say, is if a factory in Ohio closes and it then is going to be rebuilt somewhere else because costs are lower, it really matters if that's in China or if that's in Mexico. Because if it's in Mexico, you get a lot of intermediary trade between the US and Mexico. If it goes to China, it's gone. And so it matters to me where a factory goes, and it matters to me where we're trading. I would love to see like a NAFTA on steroids. That would be my, like, I'm a real pro like nearshoring person, right? Like the reason I think maybe those in the Trump administration like might hear a bit of what I'm talking about in the book and think, oh, this guy's like on our side. It all breaks down once I talk about the 1,000 reasons why we're not going to have iPhone production in Pittsburgh, right? And I want to see it in India. I want to see it in Mexico, because it matters where the stuff gets built. You can't just say if it's gone from America, it's gone. Where the other location is really matters.
All right. Let's see. We can skip that one.
Your questions.
Yeah. Do you think that Apple was a catalyst, a participant, or just a passenger in China's larger national strategy to become the world's factory as part of Made in China 2025? Or do you think it was just like oh, this is a thing that's going well, like let's join hands and work together at some point?
Okay, so I hope I'm not reframing the question, but it is very clear that in the reform period beginning in the late 70s, early 80s in China, that they really want to lure in capital into these capitalist experimentation zones like Shenzhen, and have teachers in a sense coming in to share the lessons, and for through a JV, and then the Chinese entity is going to learn those lessons and become better. But I hope I'm answering the question. I don't think anybody with that model in China could have foreseen the consequences of one super corporation and the role that they played, right? So to quote from the introduction again, the official numbers that you can go find, and someone can fact check this if they want, is like the number of Apple jobs indirectly in China, right, is 3 million per Tim Cook. The number of jobs in America that are dependent on Chinese demand, like 1.4 billion people across all industries, is as little as 1 million and as high as 2.6 million. So like, how is it possible that one corporation has more of an impact on job creation in China than all of China, effectively the most populous country, and at least the most populous middle class in the world, on America?
This is the whole argument about the trade imbalance that the Trump administration is trying to make, right? Like that's part of the trade imbalance argument.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's just taking
like
the
jobs are being created somewhere else versus here. Like make the jobs here.
Yeah.
I think that's the argument, and I think like the scale that you describe is like part of why there are people who believe that argument holds water.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about reporting on Apple or China is you never have to say like one of the, because the superlative like always works.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's nice as a journalist because you want to work with firm numbers and you don't have to caveat them. Although for the paperback version, I mean, I'll no longer be able to say the world's most valuable company. It's fallen by $700 billion since I submitted the manuscript, kind of thing. So the reason why I was trying to answer the question that way is, you're asking what is it, participant, passenger, or catalyst?
Yeah, at the time that they're creating the Made in China strategy.
Made
in China 2025, like at the time that that's being created.
So at the time, like, because that's what, I think that comes out 2015, but presumably it's in development, actually even going back to the Hu Jintao era. I don't think, my reporting basically demonstrates that they don't understand Apple's influence.
So it's as a passenger at that point.
Yeah. But then the narrative is that Apple sort of flips the script to be like, it's true that we don't have any JVs, but you don't understand how impactful we are.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think Apple is sort of like, a target, let's say, in Made in China 2025 is like, this is gonna, like, I don't think there was anything material on the part of the Chinese trying to get Apple in particular. That was already happening. And I think even for Apple, it's a surprise when they realize the sort of influence they're having. Because of course, that's not the point of what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
They're just trying to make great products.
Yep.
And I've talked to people pretty senior since the book has been published who have read it. And they've said, like, even if in 2008 we knew Xi Jinping was the next leader, what else would you have us do? I mean, we would just put in a position where we had this product. It was a total hit around the whole world.
Product market fit.
And there was no place else to build it.
Yeah.
So it's a weird question to ask a capitalist, like, Well, yeah, but just, do it someplace else where like you're not going to get those margins,
Well,
you're not
also
going to
like
get that quality.
fiduciary, shareholder value, like all of
Exactly.
that
And this
stuff
goes
too.
back to the sleepwalking thing. So the sleepwalking, whenever it's read back to me, it sounds like a biting remark.
No,
And
I don't
actually,
hear it
I'm
that
actually
way.
being very generous. I think I'm sort of letting them off the hook and saying, this is just how it happened. And I have no villains in the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that Apple regrets anything? It sounds like not.
Well, that going back to what I just said, yeah. So a great segue in a way. I
Like,
don't know.
are they in a regrettable position, or is their position just fine? Like, I think the recent news around tariffs maybe are a little, granted, who knows if a deal will get struck. Like, I don't have any, maybe
Sure.
there will be one. There was last time, there was a deal that was struck for those HTS codes. And so those products were able to continue to be made in China.
Yeah.
But right now, my understanding is like there's exceptions for those codes, but they have a timeout date, which I think is coming in July.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll be extended again, but it seems like what I'm hearing through my networks is that there's just like a lot less willingness for the Trump administration to provide these exceptions this time around.
Yeah.
And so, like, is Apple in a little bit of a tricky spot? Are they in trouble, or are they just like fine? They're just gonna roll with the punches. They're a big enough company, they can roll with the punches. So actually, this whole thing around like how they've kind of become captive to China is like, yeah, but it's fine.
It's a great question, and I'm actually really stuck on this, even having published the book. Like, so the subtitle of the book is "The Capture of the World's Greatest Company." I really do think they're captured, and I don't think there's any great strategic move for them to make. But I'm torn on when I'm speaking off the cuff. I'll sometimes say like they're in a quandary of their own making. And then when I listen to that later, I'm like, but is it of their own making? And it kind of is, but it's kind of not because I'm
of circumstance. They're in a quandary of circumstance.
Yeah, like clearly they could have made different moves. And look, I mean, I can't say the name here, but I did talk to another company, let's just say comparable to Apple in some ways. And they always had a strategy of we're never going to be more than 50% dependent on the contract manufacturer. We're going to still do our own production because of the very issues that I think I end up telling. Now, it's a little bit different industry, and maybe it wouldn't have worked for the iPhone or something. So I'm sympathetic to that, or at least I'm open to that. But there really was a decision to go all in on contract manufacturers,
that
right?
was Tim Cook's innovation.
That was Tim Cook, and that was him convincing Steve Jobs over the course of years.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I have this anecdote that in the early 2000s, Steve Jobs prints out a bunch of T-shirts that say "Mactories," and he's trying to get people excited about we're going to really take control of these factories and do this ourselves, despite already being an LG on 3 continents at that point. And the global financial, I'm sorry, not the global financial crisis, the dot-com crisis takes place. Apple loses 50% shares in a day, and like the plan just dies. But of course, they were in better financial position a few years later, and they could have made some sort of change. But at that point, the people that talked to Steve Jobs tell me he said, like, we tried that, it didn't work. And so he'd fully been convinced by Tim Cook at that point. So yeah, I'm stuck on.
So maybe there is no regret in that they are the world's second.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I'm always asked, like, what's the risk that Beijing goes after Apple? Like in the same way that they've sort of weaponized like their ownership of rare earths. Why don't they just say Apple no longer has an export license or something like that? And I think the reason that they're kind of safe there, it's still a gamble to sort of like, fingers crossed that she's going to keep us safe. But the reason why is that if you do understand the role of teacher that Apple has played, and even Huawei has called Apple the teacher, why would you go after your teacher? I mean, if Apple is employing 3 million people indirectly, that's true. Why would you go after them, right? They bring a lot to the country. And then, the question is does Apple still have something to teach them?
They still employ a lot of people in the country.
Yeah.
Like, it's a meaningful amount of employment that they provide. They're a large employer.
And even if the iPhone is pretty saturated and you don't see big changes year to year, the Vision Pro, however much of a flop that is in terms of the actual content of that device, and I bought it for $3,500 and took it back after 6 days. But have you tried it on? I mean, what it's actually capable of is phenomenal. I mean, the technology in that device is phenomenal. And it's not Foxconn that's producing it, it's Luxshare. And so the technology transfer outside the iPhone into like the next generation device is probably quite substantial. And so for Luxshare to be able to get that deal, I think that's probably quite meaningful to Beijing or to provincials.
Assuming that market category opens up.
Because I think
the jury is still out.
But you'll know better than
like
me.
A screen on your face.
I totally agree. But even the creation of the, even the processes that are working with such miniature optics and those host of technology, it doesn't just stop at the headset. It can be used for so many other things.
Sure. What is one of my investors likes to talk about, the like peacetime proceeds of the smartphone wars. Is like very cheap commodity hardware for like small cameras and all of these things that became cheap as a result. They were very expensive at one point, but as the result of mass production and manufacturing it, millions a day. Now you can get like very tiny cameras for $5.
The value. So the value of Apple in the supply chain, I think, continues to be something, even if it's not
innovation
so dependent
continues.
on the iPhone.
Do you think that any company today, like think about, so there's talk in the industry, in the consumer electronics industry, about like a new wave of hardware is coming. Unclear when we're gonna declare the start, but a new wave is coming that like delivers AI into our lives, like devices. That like whatever those devices are, was Humane 2.0 style
well, Johnny Ive, Sam Altman, right? That's the best example.
Or whatever the form factor they may take. I don't have a crystal ball. Hopefully it's not a screen in front of my face, though. That's my personal hope. Do you think that it's possible for a company, like let's say there's a next generation of company that is able to be created that is not trying to say they're going to be the next Apple, but like a new FANG is being seeded today or soon as a result of this. Do you think they could do it without relying on China? Like, could they replicate the kind of hardware success that Apple has without China? And if not, then what does that say about the future of electronics innovation in general for the world, I guess?
So are you setting me up to talk about the Trump Mobile T1 phone?
No, but you
made
can
in America?
Like.
No, of course. I mean, that's a fantasy. That's not going to be made. Look, I think the Johnny Ive, Sam Altman thing is the pertinent example because I assume, I don't know, that Johnny Ive knows the problem that my book speaks of better than I do, right? And so I would hope that if he's building hardware in the prototype stage of like, building 5 or 10 of them, that he would want to build it outside of China.
Because he doesn't want the technology and designs to be stolen and replicated so quickly?
Yeah. And because, the biggest problem, correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, about moving Apple production is just, of course it's the quality, of course it's the cost, but it's the scale, right?
Scale and supply chain as well. Because like you could move final assembly, but if all the parts are still coming from China.
Absolutely. Well, that's what they've done to India, right? And not many reporters are asking enough questions or like sort of writing the right headlines to make that known to the reader, right? Because that's the question I get all the time. I mean, even one of the Apple blogs has written that 25% of phones are now made in India. So like we're halfway there to like a bifurcated supply chain. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like all of those phones are made in China. They're just like one final step is done in India. But they're no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than anything else. So, I mean, look, it's going to be incredibly difficult for, whatever magic non-screen device they came up with, but at least they're starting from the ground up and could maybe that's got to give them an advantage versus you've got to build 230 million of them, right?
You think it's made in the U.S.?
That's what I'm saying. So
made in Greater Asia.
The problem is I don't know what the device is, so it's hard for me to talk about. But the thing is, like,
for any kind of agentic
but it's going to have memory in it, and like the memory's not coming from America. It's going to have chips in it, and like the chips aren't really coming from America. I mean, I guess maybe something like the TSMC in Arizona fab can do something, but yeah. The trouble is, and this is what like will be obvious to you and probably your listeners, but isn't really made clear in the reporting. Like when Trump is asking Tim Cook, like, I demand that you build iPhones in America, like what we're sort of missing in that discussion is like, it's not even up to Tim Cook to build a factory here. Like there are no Apple factories.
He tried to build a factory here. In Texas.
With Flex, yeah. But that's the point. Like for Flex to be successful building a Mac Pro or whatever, I mean, not only do you need the experiential know-how and everything else, but Flex also needs to have dozens of other clients so that when they have the appropriate workforce, like they're rotating from one project to the next and being ultra efficient. So it's not even a matter of Tim Cook convincing or not even a matter of convincing Tim Cook or Tim Cook feeling the pressure. He's got to convince like a final assembly partner, but then he's got to convince a whole bunch of like next door manufacturers in theory that would surround the factory with all the plastic injection molding and the metal tooling and stamping and everything else. And then they would also have to simultaneously somehow convince all these other clients to not choose China, but to choose America so that you could build that up or whatever. And like, that's so many things that all need to happen more or less at once, that's what makes it such a gargantuan task, right? But you've lived this. Does that resonate with you, like as a criticism?
Yeah, it does. I do think that there's certain amounts of, like, I do think it's actually possible to do assembly near shore or within the United States for certain types of products.
Yeah.
And there can be benefits to doing so. As I think about, our business has diversified outside of just high volume electronics, which is my background, into compute infrastructure and frankly defense electronics, both of which are in a kind of war. The AI race, it's a type of, it is not a war, it's a race. And then also like defense electronics and our ability to build them efficiently, effectively, cheaply enough that like they can work in asymmetric warfare, which is essentially how warfare works these days. Like, like a $500 drone can take out an entire like multi-billion-dollar, I don't know, missile warship, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So like we don't have the iteration speed and the know-how to essentially get the yields up high enough. It seems like, as someone that comes from high volume electronics, I've just been so surprised as I've learned more and more about these industries who are like, I think under, existential pressure to win their respective races, that like knowing that, the main competition is often on the other side could be China in both cases, like, and China clearly is excellent at building electronic devices or is excellent at ramping yields effectively.
Yeah.
And America is not excellent at those things. And I don't think it's because we're like not smart or it's like maybe it's that Apple cultural pressure that was also, I think, part of the indoctrination into what like built China's the rise of the electronics industry in China, of like seeking something amazing and exceptional. Like I think that cultural like pressure is often missing.
Yeah.
Or this idea of like design for manufacturability, although Apple never really designed for manufacturability, but like, we see that in the AI race in particular, that like, they're just trying to get like racks into data centers. And so if that means that like some of those trays don't work in the rack, like that might be acceptable for the customer. They're just like trying to, like, they're in a similar state where Apple was, where they just like trying to meet demand. And so they're like less focused on what are all the changes we're going to make in the design to make it so that you can like put these parts in a bag, shake it, and it assembles itself. That's the ideal of assembly, just for everybody's knowledge. And let me just say, like, a AI rack does not assemble itself and has very low first pass yields. And so if you imagine like in a race, you are racing against entities that are building their electronics in a country that's very good at building electronics, like that seems concerning. So It seems actually very important that we maintain the know-how of how to build things here, how to improve yields here, how to design for manufacturability, how to design for automation, how to build things that are adaptable. I think that's like critically important for being able to maintain any kind of competitive opportunity space for the future, even if we ultimately lose. But like at least we have a fighting chance in certain areas. If we abdicate all knowledge, then we won't have a fighting chance at all.
And abdicate's a great word, because I think so much of the China discussion is the scaremongering stuff, and what Congress often resorts to is the idea that the Chinese stole it all, right? And like it's far more disconcerting. It's that we gave it all away.
We taught them, and then they took that knowledge and they made it even better.
Yeah. So I think it's a more disquieting message. Okay, I'm falling back into the role of journalist, and I want to ask you a question. I genuinely don't know the answer to this question, but if Tesla can build, maybe the Cybertruck's not the greatest product, but the Model Y in Texas, and even just like the batteries, with Panasonic in Nevada, and SpaceX can build, cutting edge, world leading rockets.
Yeah.
Why can't Sam Altman and Johnny Ive build the next great AI first handheld device in America?
I think they could. I think supply chain will be the question. Like, what is required to build it? And I mean, there's
but these
stuff
other
in the
products have supply chains.
Yes, they do, but like, you know, the chips are still coming from other places, etc.
Yeah.
I think battery manufacturing is particularly important for EVs. I'm not an EV expert, so I'm sure I'll get like people who are experts kind of commenting here.
Mm-hmm.
But like the batteries themselves are he went and he built factories to make sure he had a supply chain of battery, and that the battery is it's integrated into the design. It's actually a competitive edge in the design, at least as I understand it.
Yeah.
And so they took a weakness and made it a strength. And I think also like the ethos of that company, at least from, I've never worked at Tesla, but I've, you know, read about like this idea of like building the factory, building the dreadnought, like the factory itself is the product.
Yes, the machine that builds the machine.
Yeah, it just happens to produce cars, but the product is the factory.
Yes.
And I think that's the right mentality. But that's a very different mentality than many business leaders who don't have manufacturing background. Many business leaders are like, I just want my numbers, my throughput, like I want my output. And so they're really focused on like, how do I tune my small levers, like my little knobs? Like, how do I just like push on my suppliers to cut a cent off or whatever? Because that's like a spreadsheet version. Whereas I think a completely different cultural perspective on like, no, the product we build is an efficient factory. And the more efficient we make our factory, then all of these other things are going to like work out.
Yes.
And that we actually need to do upfront investment and spend money in ways that might not make sense on paper to start, but ultimately create these competitive advantages that are fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And so I think that mentality of like building the factory is one that like we don't see a lot of that in the United States. So even when we see manufacturing in the United States, it's usually with a contract manufacturer. You mentioned Flex, Jabil, you know, Foxconn is here, like Wistron is here. Like all those global manufacturers also build here in the United States, and they're certainly part of critical supply chains for AI infrastructure. Like all of those companies have roles to play, but there's very few companies that like their name is on the factory and everybody's badge says the name of the brand. And really the only companies I've seen do that have been kind of like pre-IPO startups, like that have approached essentially a certain amount of escape velocity, that like they're not going to go out of business in 2 years, and they've like managed to build factories here. But the products are also very simple. It's like a board and a box with some screws. It's not like complex optics or other elements.
Or you're in industries connected to DoD, so like you have to be building it here. So there's some added incentive.
Certainly. But like if we had more commercial manufacturing here, it would probably be easier, and like our defense manufacturing would probably be better and easier as well. Because they would like, there would be more cross-pollination of, you know, in both directions. Like I think there's things that the defense industry does that actually consumer electronics and commercial electronics could benefit from, in terms of how they document certain things, how they don't rely on tribal knowledge in the way that like conventional commercial electronics do, because they can't. The regulations don't let them. And that means that like continuous improvement looks different there. And I think the drive for continuous improvement is very, very strong in defense electronics, and also the drive towards like the mission criticality. Like oftentimes like these are safety critical, or, you know, like if you're making an energizer, it's like going to make the bomb go off or not go off. So it's like a really important part. It's got to work 100% of the time. Like Apple would love to make products that worked 100% of the time. They do not. I thought that naively, actually, when I was interviewing at Apple. I was like, I want to go to Apple because they make a million things a day. Like they can't possibly even have 1% like fallout, because that'd be too many things. And then like I walk into Apple and I find out they have typical industry metrics, maybe slightly better in certain areas, slightly worse in others. Like for, you know, their yields, like somewhere between, across the industry, somewhere between 80 and 95% yield is pretty standard for devices. So there's certainly lots of defects, but like
lots of bone piles
in defense, you know, 100% of them got to work. So there's like learnings that could go from defense back into the commercial market. And I just don't think there's a lot of cross-pollination.
And so I think I'm pretty optimistic about some of this happening. So like I keep getting asked about the iPhone. Can the iPhone be built in Ohio, Pittsburgh?
Like,
and of course,
silly question.
I say no. But yeah, it is a silly question, because it's like you're talking about the most complicated voluminous product in Apple's portfolio. And so I'm so sort of harshly against the idea that it can be built here, just to sort of make the point that I think sometimes I begin to sound more like anti U.S. manufacturing renaissance than I actually am. Right,
there's a huge opportunity.
There's a huge chasm between like the most complex thing at 230 million a year versus actually just doing more stuff here. And I would love to see more.
And I think automation and maybe humanoids, depending on how much you think those are real or not,
Yeah,
which I think is a debate in the discourse. Like, I think these can create like other opportunities that maybe didn't exist 10 years ago or now. So we've got to wrap up. So thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us. And, you know, we will have continued conversations about a variety of different topics for engineering and manufacturing leaders. And I hope this was educational. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Anna. Thank you.